Hello, boils and ghouls. Today will be the first video in the Fleshed Out Friday series. This will be a short stories edition. Basically, I will be providing my reviews, thoughts, and opinions during these videos, and in this one, we will be covering H.P. Lovecraft's The Shunned House. So lie back in the cot and take your hour-long nap as we discuss this terrifying short story. The Shunned House is a riveting story written by H.P. Lovecraft about a house that no longer finds residents and haunts the minds of the people around it. The narrator quickly describes his obsession with the house, and although it instills fear in his heart, his fascination is never scared away. Eventually, his uncle, Dr. Elithu Whipple, shares some of the history he has learned about the house with the narrator, and he is drawn in even more to uncover aspects of the house. After some time researching as much as they can, the pair decide to spend a night in the dilapidated residence, and they come equipped with flamethrowers and a Crook's tube to combat whatever entity resides. Most people dare not spend the night in this haunted house, and our duo quickly discovers why. After the narrator is awoken, he hears a scream and discovers that it is the scream of his uncle. The rest of the night plays out in horrific ways as the narrator encounters terrible revelations and the macabre. What was once a source of fascination and mystery was ripped from the mind of youthfulness and would forever remain a deep source of pain. This was an incredibly interesting short story, and I was flying through the pages to discover what happened next. Admittedly, it was a little cumbersome to read through because of the writing style, but some of the quotes and depictions throughout the story are fantastic. Within the first few pages, an image is created when the narrator describes how the boys used to run the area and how it took courage for one of the boys to climb the ladder into the attic. The imagery of seeing a group of young boys running around on their turf and the atmosphere this description creates is great. Furthermore, the reader is instantly given the impression that the house, including the foliage, is unworldly, and that people enter the house to scare themselves, knowing that it is unnatural. Such a fantastic line and moment of world building. This is followed by another perfect description that creates a feeling of youthful courage. It is described in a way that depicts what bravery looks like and feels like to a young boy. It does not undermine or compare this action to other forms of bravery. It just is, and it holds its own place on the pedestal of courageousness. This world is clearly created as the reader is thrown into this hazy atmosphere of mystery, and it genuinely feels as though we are a part of the group as the characters push onward. Speaking of the characters, we are never given the narrator's name, but he is still awesomely rich in his development. The reader feels his youthful bliss and fascination resonate from him as he eagerly uncovers more about the house. He also feels very real, and the fear he encounters is genuine. The point when he hears the scream of his uncle is a prime example of the reader being thrown into the reality of these characters. He did not want to confront what he feared even though he knew he had to, but he instantly lost confidence in the tools they had brought to protect themselves. This event makes him feel vulnerable and fearful, with the reader experiencing those emotions in the exact same moment. The other notable character is Dr. Elithu Whipple, who is an aging man but still sharp-witted and logical. One of the moments that conveys this character well is when the narrator describes him to the reader. Dr. Whipple is someone with awareness that the hobbies he finds interesting may be horrific in the mind of a young boy. What he thinks is interesting creates a sense of perfection in his life, but that same hobby would be horrible and torturous to a young boy that has no interest in that matter. Our two main characters are distinct during the story, but they maintain a genuineness to them that truly represents their humanity. Overall, The Shunned House was exhilarating to read through, and if the writing style feels taxing, just quickly read through it once and then read through it again at another time. The story is breathtaking in its complexity, and the characters are remarkably human in a world of the outlandish. The reader becomes engrossed in their journey, and I found myself excited by the things they were thrilled by, scared by the things they were fearful of, and numb to the consequences of decisions that could not be changed. Give this short story a few tries until you are thrusted into the unworldly plane that is H.P. Lovecraft's The Shunned House. Tidbits of Frontal Lobe. We have reached the end of the review, but I will continue and go over some of my thoughts or questions that remain. So I invite you to stick around and provide any of your ideas or opinions in the comments. That should insinuate that beyond this moment, there may be grotesquely rotten spoilers that stick around longer than the odor of a decomposing lab experiment. Turn around if you're squeamish, because it's not safe anymore. Now that only diehard creeps remain, let us jump right in. When the narrator is describing how the servants' gossip is unanimous with the fungus, it allows for an interesting dissection of what this comparison could mean. A fungus gets bigger and bigger as it grows, similarly to how gossip moves from person to person. A characteristic of fungi growth as hyphae is that they are specifically adapted to invade substrates and tissues. To me, this matches with the comparison to gossip, in that gossip can sometimes latch onto people that are not seeking to partake in such activities, thus still allowing the gossip to move and grow. Perhaps as well it is just meant to trigger a guttural response with the reader. When we hear the term fungus, it can have the ability to make the reader think of mold, which holds a somewhat negative connotation to it, very much like the concept of gossiping. What are your thoughts on that moment within the story? A really interesting part was when the narrator mentioned the settlement in 1636, because this was the actual year when Roger Williams acquired land from Narragansett sachems Canonicus and Miantonomi and established Providence Plantations. Providence Plantations was the first permanent European-American settlement in the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. The settlers were seeking freedom of worship and adopted a covenant which stressed the separation of religious and civil affairs. This was a really interesting and thoughtful addition to the story, and I wondered if it served any other purpose. Could this history of the land have anything to do with the present-day state of the house being haunted? Is it possible that the conflicted history of the Huguenots followed the Roulettes and sort of cursed the land? This sounds reasonable to me, considering the land was settled by people that were seeking freedom of worship. With a twisted sense of irony, this could possibly be the darkness that perverted the land. The Roulettes were a family of Huguenots. The Huguenots was a religious group that was involved in religious conflicts as Catholic hostility grew, and even still they faced difficulties of acceptance on land that had been settled by people seeking freedom to worship. This history of religious pursuits and conflicts could have resulted in the corruption of the land. What was once pure in intentions resulted in the wickedness that lurked within the house. It seemed that the Roulettes were buried on the land, and the narrator was unable to find any sort of burial transfer, so the history that this family faced was ingrained within the land, which resulted in its distortion. The very foundation of the house was diseased, which could account for the scene when the narrator finds a roaring beast under the house. Also worth pointing out is the fact that characters would be babbling in French when the house seemed to possess them. What are your opinions on this, though? What caused the house to be haunted? What was the evil that lurked within the house? One of the more action-packed parts of this story was when the narrator described what items they had brought with them to the house during the overnight stay. They brought with them a tool for a physical encounter, flamethrowers, and for a non-physical encounter, Crook's tube. The idea of someone procuring flamethrowers made me chuckle, but the more interesting tool was that of the Crook's tube. It is unique that the story actually mentioned this piece of equipment because they wanted to visualize the non-material entity. If it ended up being that, they logically surmised that whatever was inhabiting the house had to be something that could be explained by the laws of science and reason. So they brought the Crook's tube to catch the first glimpse of this entity. It's just a very fascinating detail and component within the story. Alas, we have reached the point where we discuss the ending, which was fantastic, and I could feel the character's pain as he decidedly pushed forward to destroy the entity. Perhaps the author did not explicitly state what the entity was, because the vagueness is more purposeful for the story. Maybe the entity that haunted the house was created because of all the misfortune that occurred there, and grew because of all the superstition that people would direct to the house. So really, the monstrosity was created by the worst aspects of the people the house encountered. Death, illness, negative traits, conflicts, and this ultimately resulted in an unexplainable evil that hungered for more. What do you guys think? To me, it seems to be more than just a simple haunted house story. Some of the references and backstory seem too substantial. Well, dear creeps, that concludes this video and my thoughts of this riveting short story. Please let me know what you think and comment below. I appreciate the time you spent and the contemplation you mustered up for our creepy club. I'll see you guys next time, lurking in the shadows.